Secondary dominant chords are the difference between harmony that sounds like this and harmony that sounds like this. This is one of those music theory concepts that sounds complicated, but it's actually really common. Secondary dominant chords come up all the time in pretty much every style of music. In my experience, they're the most common reason you'll come across a chord that doesn't seem like it should belong in the home key of a song. So let's use this short example chord progression to understand first, what are secondary dominants? Why do they work so well? And then I'm going to give you a shortcut to find the 4 most common secondary dominant chords in any major key. First, I'm going to play those 2 examples again, but let's look at them in terms of numbers. 1, 6, 5, and 1. And then I'm going to show the numbers just in terms of the home key before we talk secondary dominance. So 1, 3, 6, 2, 5 played as a sus chord, and back to 1. Now, if you're not familiar with using numbers or Roman numerals like that, the reason we do that is so that we can understand how these chords all relate to each other in terms of the key that we're in. In this case, we're in C major. You want to be able to quickly recognize these patterns in any key. So just as easily, for example, recognize this in D flat major. Now don't worry, for the rest of the video, I'm going to stay in C major, so this is easier to understand. But you're probably getting a sense, there are a lot of prerequisite skills that you need before a concept like secondary dominance is really going to be useful to you. You know, I'm using inversions for good voice leading between the chords here, and I want you to be able to analyze things in terms of the key of the song, whether or not we're in C major. So if those things feel like they're beyond you, the best way that I can help you is if you go to pianofluency.com and become a member. I have a progressive learning path built there to help you develop those skills in a fun way, and a whole community of other students who are doing the same thing. So that's the best way I can help you if you want to get beyond the theory in this video and really apply these things at the piano. With that, let's get back to some of this fun music theory. To understand why we even need the concept of secondary dominance, let's zoom in on this second chord, this E dominant 7, that leads so nicely into the A minor. The root note of that chord belongs in C major. It's the 3, 1, 2, 3, in the key of C major. But it's supposed to be a minor chord, right? If we only use diatonic chords, that is, chords that are built using notes from the major scale, the 3 chord should be minor. Here, however, we're hearing it played as a major chord or a dominant 7 chord. When this happens, a chord that's supposed to be minor in the home key is instead played as a major chord or a dominant 7 chord. That's a tip-off that you're likely dealing with a secondary dominant. So now let's explain, what does this mean? Secondary dominant. First, dominant. A dominant chord is a fancy name for a 5 chord. Dominant and tonic mean 5 and 1. And the dominant to tonic resolution is the strongest resolution in Western music. You can hear it at the end of a lot of pieces of classical music, like a piece by Haydn or Beethoven might end like this. 5, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1. Right? You're really hearing that tension and resolution. Or if you want to hear the tension even more strongly, there's a dominant chord. We really want to hear the tonic chord afterwards. So that's the concept of a dominant chord. It's a fancy name for a 5 chord, which really wants to resolve to 1. How about secondary? What makes something a secondary dominant? Well, a secondary dominant is the 5 chord for another key. To use these first 3 chords in my example, C is our 1 chord, E dominant 7 is the 5 chord in the key of A minor. So no, E dominant 7 doesn't belong in the key of C, but it does belong in the key of A minor, specifically A harmonic minor. And you can hear that same resolution, right? 5, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1. So even though that E chord is non-diatonic, right, it uses a note that doesn't belong in the key, our ears accept it because we're hearing that really strong tension and resolution. And the chord that we resolve to does belong in the home key. This is true of all of these secondary dominants, that the chord we're resolving to is a different diatonic chord that belongs in the home key. Really, any chord other than 1. Moving forward in my example, we can also understand the D dominant 7 chord in this way. Here we have another non-diatonic note. It's D dominant 7, so we have an F sharp, where normally, if we were staying in the key, this should be a D minor chord, or maybe D minor 7. But the D dominant 7 makes sense if we think of it as a 5 of 5. D dominant 7 is the 5 in the key of G major, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here's my 5 chord in the key of G major. And G is our 5 chord in the key of C major. So we immediately resolve to a G chord. Here I'm playing it as a sus chord, but it's still a 5 chord. And because we do that, our ears accept that F sharp. The F sharp is just leading really naturally into the next chord. So you're starting to get a sense for how this works. Secondary dominants rely on tension and resolution. The tense chord is the secondary dominant. It's a 5 chord in some other key. The resolution is that other key that we resolve to. Let's do this with the 2 chord. We haven't used that yet in my example. So in the key of C, D minor is our 2 chord. I'd like you to try to find the secondary dominant that leads into 2. So you can pause the video here if you want. And we can find it together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's our dominant in the key of D minor. If we play it as a major or dominant 7 chord, we'll get that really strong 5-to-1 resolution in D minor. And if we play that in context with some other chords that make sense in C, there might be a moment there where hearing the C sharp when we're in the key of C major feels unexpected or tense, but we immediately resolve it to that D minor chord. And so our ears accept it. And it's actually a really nice sound to hear that tension and resolution. Now, the good news is there actually aren't that many different secondary dominants that are common. And at this point, we've covered 3 of the 4 most common secondary dominant chords. I told you I was going to give a shortcut to find them. And let's do that now. We'll go back to thinking of these chords in terms of the home key. So we had D dominant 7 as the 5 of 5. We could think of that, instead of 5 of 5, as 2, just 2 dominant 7, or 2 major. In either case, this is not the chord we're supposed to hear in the key of C major, but it works if it's a secondary dominant. Now we can apply that same logic for 5 of 6. Let's just think of it as 3. And for 5 of 2, let's just think of it as 6. There's a really nice pattern here. Every one of the chords that is typically played as a minor chord in a major key, so that would be 2, 3, and 6 out of our diatonic triads, those chords will often be secondary dominants if you see them showing up instead as major chords. Like any piece of music theory like this, it gets to be more useful once you start to see it all over the place in context in the music that you learn. So for me, I have my own kind of connotations that go along with each of these secondary dominant chords based on maybe some Stevie Wonder song where I came across the 5 of 2. And I know that sound. I might think of that when I think of that chord function. You'll start to have your own associations with each of these chords if you're primed to recognize them as you learn them in context in real pieces of music. And it can be pretty fun once you start to get familiar with this. Okay, it's a 3 chord should be minor, instead it's major. I wonder if it's going to resolve to 6, because it might be that classic 5 of 6 sound. And that's when things start to get fun, because you'll recognize this pattern both by analysis and just by ear. And something that seemed complicated before starts to be really familiar every time it comes up in a new piece of music. Now, I left out one of the 4 most common secondary dominants. That is 5 of 4. So for fun, I'd like you to try to find this on your own. In the key of C, our 4 is going to be F. What's the 5 of 4? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 in the key of F is C. We're back to C. Okay, so the only way to recognize the 5 of 4 as a secondary dominant is if it's played as a dominant 7 chord. You know, if you play C as C dominant 7, it introduces this B flat, and the B flat doesn't belong in C, but it does belong in F. So for most of this video, I've been using the major or dominant 7 chords interchangeably for these secondary dominants, because a lot of times you'll come across these chords in pop music and they won't actually have the 7th there in the chord. It'll just be a triad, but it's still acting as a secondary dominant. In this case, however, it's just going to sound like a 1 chord unless you actually play it as a dominant 7 chord. And then hear it resolve to 4. And that comes up actually a lot. You'll start recognizing it all over the place, especially say in kind of blues or gospel influenced music. The 1 chord becoming dominant and then leading to the 4 chord. So that's it. And let's show these on screen now. We have 5 of 2, 5 of 4, 5 of 5, and 5 of 6. Those are our 4 most common secondary dominant chords, and an easy translation or shortcut for all of them is just to think of them in terms of the home key, right? So 5 of 2 becomes 6. 5 of 4 becomes 1. 5 of 5 becomes 2. And 5 of 6 becomes 3. With those shortcuts, you now have a foothold to recognize these secondary dominant chords when they come up in any piece of music that you play. And over time, you'll start to develop your own associations between these different chord functions and specific songs you've learned them in, which is a great way to get to where you can recognize them by ear. For more straightforward piano education that helps you explore the instrument creatively, remember to subscribe to this channel. And you can also consider becoming a member at pianofluency.com. My name is Ted. Thank you for joining me.